Everybody, and welcome to our webinar on minorities in music. I really hope that you're all doing okay, staying safe and well. My name is Tim. I'm the founder and president of NJGI, and today I brought on a few experts to discuss their experiences and perspectives on this topic. Before we get into the questions, would you all like to introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about your experiences and stuff?
Sure. My name is Terrence Thornhill, and I'm the director of the Harambe Chamber Orchestra, which is an orchestra dedicated to performing works by composers of color and women. And I'm also the instrumental director at Kent Place School in Summit, New Jersey.
Hi, I'm Olive. I play viola, and I'm going to be a sophomore at SUNY Purchase. Terrence's orchestra Harambe was basically my first introduction to playing underrepresented composers and just basically trying to continue that work with more programs.
My name is Kaylin Williams. I'm a rising senior at Morristown Baird School, and I play violin and piano. And it wasn't really till I joined Harambe that I got to play works by minority composers.
Hi, my name is Marcus Impanza, and I'm a rising junior at the Purchase Conservatory of Music. I've served as an orchestra player in many different settings, playing all kinds of music, and just excited and glad to be speaking with all of you.
Thank you very much. Now let's get to the questions, and please don't hesitate to talk about your own experiences or accounts when you're answering. They're super valuable. So just to start this off, what are your thoughts on diversity initiatives in major orchestras?
However, I think the mistake that a lot of orchestras are making is that to make it seem as though by implementing these programs, they are somehow not racist or less racist, the reason why I say that is because while we do have these programs, the institutions themselves are still upholding the institutions themselves were created by white men, some of their policies and traditions still uphold this kind of hostile culture within classical music. And I think that as much as we can bring in more people of color into classical music, we are also at the same time bringing them into a hostile situation. And it's not until we change the structure of these institutions that we can actually see the change that we would like to.
I agree. Thank you. Does anyone else have anything?
I mean, I think just something that I've considered when thinking about this is that a lot of the excuses made are that, we really want to have a diverse orchestra, but because children of color are discouraged from such a young age, we're just not going to find them because they just don't get to this level, which isn't necessarily true because there are organizations full of incredibly talented players of color. But I think it's also important to pair the diversity initiatives with programs from a young age that encourage children of color and include them and, make it a less hostile situation, like Marcus said.
I believe that diversity initiatives in major orchestras can be good things when they're inspired by the right reasons. But I feel like a lot of times these programs are there just to prove that they're trying to include diverse voices and musicians in their orchestras and their programs, when they're just doing it to pretty much check their box to make sure that they're considered a fully functioning and diverse organization. When kind of like what Olive was saying, when you see those diverse programs and initiatives that are starting in orchestras that aren't paired with programs that are helped to actually build diversity in orchestras, then they seem pretty empty. And that's what seems to have been happening for the majority of the time. Now, because there seems to be a movement going on, people are trying to dig a little deeper and think a little bit more in depth about how they're going to make their orchestras seem not racist or not biased. So I feel like we're heading in the right direction, but we still have a long way to go.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, next question. Do you guys think that how do you guys think the climate of classical music discourages students of color? Like, do you guys have any examples or experiences, anything like that to show?
Well, first of all, I mean, there's just not a lot of, I guess, popular or like performed, I guess, composers of color. So that in and of itself, like within classical music, and I feel like that in and of itself can discourage people, because like, why would you want to enter, I guess, a community where all of the composers, at least all of the composers that you know, or that are like praised or that are performed regularly, don't look like you and don't have any of the same experiences you do. Like, it's, I don't know. I feel like that just like by itself is discouraging.
Yeah, I think that representation is a huge issue. If you can't see yourself in professional groups that are playing the music that you want to play, then it's discouraging. It makes you feel like you can't do it. I was very lucky to have a middle school director who was a black man for the first couple of years of my middle school experience. So I was able to see somebody kind of do what I had wanted to do, which helped inspired me to keep going. Um, but just like Kaylin was saying, the repertoire choices seem to come from the same demographic almost all of the time. Um, I actually was thinking about this the other day. I hadn't played a composer. I hadn't played a black composer's music until I didn't have any hair on my head. So the entire time that I played cello, I had hair on my head, like through college and all that stuff like that. I never played a black composer, which is the impetus in starting a group kind of like Harambe. Um, but representation, repertoire choices are both huge reasons why it could be a discouraging field for kids of color to join.
I'd also like to add, just even from a teaching perspective, you know, especially when your teacher does not look like you or doesn't share remotely the same experiences as you know, that can also be very discouraging, you know. And I never had a lesson with anyone of color until I would say the beginning of my sophomore year of high school, but then I had already been playing violin for about 5 years. And I think for some people it's like longer, you know, and to not have someone who can also relate to you on a level of being Black within classical music can also a lot of the time be very discouraging.
These are all kind of hidden things that aren't really explicit deters for communities of color in music, but are still very real. But there's also pretty vile, just straight up white supremacy in a lot of groups and professional groups. I'm not going to name the orchestra, but I have a colleague in a very, very famous, one of the best orchestras in the world, who was playing a piece of music, and when they came back during intermission, there was a noose in his locker. And this happened 2 years ago, um, which is just absolutely crazy. And there are maybe not as many um, extreme cases like that, but there are lots of um, more than microaggressions for kids of color who are coming into orchestra, of people just believing that if you, even if you've practiced and you've made it as far as you've made it, people think that you're there to fill a quota. You know, I still experience this as an adult performing in professional groups. Um, they feel like that the only reason why you're there is that you're there to check that box. You're there to help fill that diversity initiative for that orchestra, and it has nothing to do with the hard work that you've done. These are all very, very discouraging, and it doesn't stem just from orchestra. This is everywhere, but because we're talking about orchestra, that's something that can be very discouraging for kids of color in orchestras.
Yeah, and I think also because orchestra is and classical music is something that's built on like levels and like, you know, hierarchy, and it is seen as like a normally like white tradition. It creates an environment that really praises white men and just becomes very volatile for anyone who doesn't fit that category.
Okay, thank you guys. Next, I want to talk about the exclusivity and elitism in the classical community, specifically like the stereotypes that are pushed onto people of color or students of color, like the fact that they'd only want to play jazz, world, or modern music. Do you guys have any thoughts on this? Anything you'd want to elaborate on?
I feel like for me personally, and maybe it's just because of the school that I go to or the town that I live in, which is just not very diverse. Um, Whenever I tell people that I play the violin or I perform, people are always like, "Oh my God, like you should really get into like jazz violin," or like, "Wouldn't it be so cool if you did like hip hop violin?" And all these things, like, I wouldn't object to. Like, I'd honestly love to do them, but it just feels like isolating because they don't really do it to like my white counterparts. Like I feel like people just aren't used to seeing a lot of people of color, specifically Black people, in the classical music community or just playing an instrument that's like typically classical music. And I feel like people kind of expect Black people to almost like, I don't really know the right word to use or if there is a word to describe this, but I feel like they expect Black people to like urbanize it or something. I don't really know, but I feel like people just aren't used to just seeing Black like classical musicians.
Those are also like subtle digs. I mean, classical music is considered such a higher art and like the most elite, the most complicated, the most thoughtful music ever written. And when they see someone that um, is somebody of color, they sometimes they automatically assume that you can't perform that work, um, or you can't do it justice. So you might as well do something easier like jazz, which is like such an asinine statement, or um, or hip hop, like Kaylin was saying. All of these things, which are fantastic art forms and are just as valid as the Eurocentric music that a lot of us were kind of forced to play. But just because I'm black doesn't mean that I'm an expert at that. You know, I have 2 degrees in music, and 0% of that was spent studying black composers or urbanized music or anything like that. Um, so when you push that on me, just looking at me, then I'm gonna feel some type of way about it. And it also that adds into feeling like that's not someplace that I want to spend my time. I'm gonna spend my career in.
Yeah, I think even for me, in my experience, I've also had multiple times where, going into a rehearsal space and having my violin case, and it's kind of like an oblong case, but the the automatic assumption is that I've gotten trumpet or saxophone or trombone, and which is, I mean, those are amazing instruments, right? But like everyone automatically assumes that I'm a jazz musician, that I'm there to play jazz, or like and it's never um or when I say violin, then it's almost met with a sort of like almost shock, that oh, there's a black man playing the violin, and I think um, yeah, there's sort of this racist this culture within classical music where the second you see someone of color playing an orchestral instrument in particular, um, you know it's automatically assumed that we are less than, that we will never be able to, I guess, um, uh, reach the level in which our white or, Eastern Asian counterparts would, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you guys. Next, I want to shift the focus a little bit more to older students, maybe students in colleges, music schools. What are your thoughts on the racial representation in the repertoire or the faculty at these music schools?
Well, I can say that, it is, a bit disappointing, you know, going in, because I mean, I can say for purchase, none of the classical music faculty, none of the string faculty are of color, um, and it's kind of discouraging because you look up to these teachers and whatnot, and as much as you respect them, it's also a feeling of like I don't belong because none of these people kind of look like me. And For me personally, it wasn't until my junior year of high school where I saw my the first person of color performing, you know, which for me that at that point was also a bit inspiring. But back to in terms of repertoire, I feel like we, especially the colleges, we tend to use the music of Black composers or inspired by other cultures as like sort of you know, for an event. You know, at Purchase, there was a Black History concert where we played one work by Charles Dawson and, you know, George Gershwin. And the feeling was kind of like, well, here we have a Black History Month concert, and here you are playing one piece by a Black composer, but you're also playing another piece by a white man who wrote Black music, or who wrote music inspired by African American culture. And it's kind of like, you know, any time we try to bring up playing music by non-conventional composers, it's kind of, you know, we're saving that for an event. You know, there has to be a reason to play a Black composer, there has to be a reason to play a woman. And you know, it kind of feeds into this mentality that all of the white male composers are, you know, the best, and they should be seen as such.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, when we're talking about faculty, it's, you know, a lot of excuses are made, and it's just a matter of, you know, you can't look systemic racism in the face and just say, well, we don't understand why people aren't just coming to us ready to take the job, because they were just basically saying, you know, we would love to have Black faculty, they just aren't applying. And that's not fair, because more effort should be put in to find faculty that look like your students. And that's just how it should be. So I think that one of the biggest issues is that there just isn't really any effort being put into it.
To Olive's point, because of the systemic racism that has affected, you know, classical music, you're going to have to do the work to try to make it better. It's not going to just fall in people's laps. Um, it's been drilled into a lot of our minds that some of these things aren't even really obtainable for us, and it has nothing to do with qualifications. So again, to Olive's point, you're going to really have to do the work, and if that's something that you really value and care about your institution, do the work and find, if you do just a little bit of work, you're going to find so many wonderful options, and really change how you're going to be, your institution will be viewed.
Let's say if there's classical musicians watching this, what would you guys want to tell them like, what would be your recommendation on how they could promote or better this cause for people of color in classical music? Like, what could they do to help, I don't know, just better the environment, the climate of classical music?
Well, I think that it would be very important to not view this as helping out the Black people. You know, I think you go about it wrong when you start looking at it in terms of we're doing this to help out people of color. We're doing this to help out, you know, help change classical music, but really it's about looking at it for what it is. And this is not necessarily a Black problem, but it's a white problem. It's a problem of white supremacy. It's a problem of white racism, you know. And so the institutional powers within it, you know, and so everyone that is in a place of power, you know, taking a deep look into themselves and their institutions, and seeing what biases have I learned that I need to unlearn, starting, and then you know, making an active effort to seek out you know, musicians of color. You know, there are a lot of, I think we're past the excuse of, oh, well, there are no people of color that are talented enough to join my institution. You know, there are hundreds of talented, intelligent, capable, you know, musicians of color that are waiting, you know, for an institution like yours to either seek them out or offer them something. It's just a matter of when are you going to get on board? When are white people going to decide that they're going to put an end to a lot of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that effort is the most important thing. And like me as a white player, I completely have the option to just stay in the dark and have a sheltered education and not play underrepresented composers and just, you know, do it the way that people have been doing it for hundreds of years. But because I've been able to do these programs like Harambe and like Project 440 and see Sphinx perform and stuff like that, I just know that it's not going to be an enriching education and I need to go further. So I think that research is probably the most important thing, like because I know that my music history course isn't going to teach me anything about Black musicians. Like I'm getting myself a book about Black people in classical music from, you know, as long as it's been documented and stuff like that. I mean, the information right now isn't as readily accessible as it should be, and it's just basically our jobs to go and find it and make it more accessible.
I think that, and this is more the perspective of the student, students should remember that you are paying to go to whatever institution that you're going to and be in whatever organizations that you want to be in. Like these people work for you. Um, so if you demand a certain kind of education, then ideally they'll be forced to give you that type of education. And and this work hasn't really been talked about. I mean, I'm sure it has been talked about, but it hasn't really been as noticed as it has been now. And putting pressure on these organizations and putting pressure on your school teachers and putting pressure on your English teachers to read Black literature or literature from writers of color, putting pressure on all these gatekeepers to do the right thing is a really effective thing that gives everyone a voice and actually can promote some change. Um, because as prominent as white supremacy, I think, is and kind of how deviant it is in our field, I feel like there are a lot of well meaning people who don't know any better because of the white supremacy that has actually taken place. So I think that if we educate people and we put pressure on the people making decisions, then hopefully things will start to change for the better.
Okay, thank you. Um, is there anything else you guys would like to share, whether it be something that we haven't covered, maybe a personal experience you'd like for people to know about, or maybe you have some parting words to students of color out there?
This is going off of Olive's point about like effort, but I think there are so many amazing minority composers out there, and there are so many amazing minority musicians, and I think you really have to find them because a lot of the time they don't really get the spotlight that they deserve, but they're out there and they're ready to be heard and they're ready to be played, and I feel like a lot of people um, just need to know that like a lot of the times they won't just like be handed to you. Like you really have to go and seek the music.
That's a great point, Caitlin. It's unfortunately it's difficult to find a lot of these composers and actually play music by them. The hoops that I have to jump through finding music for Harambe is incredible, where I can just, in a matter of 3 clicks, find any Mozart, anything that I ever want to play on IMSLP for free. The accessibility of this music is not, it's not where it needs to be to make it as simple as it should be. Um, there are there are so many pieces that we've done in our orchestra at Harambe that don't even have recordings, which is like mind-boggling to me. That some of this music that is so good, that is some of the best music that I've been a part of, doesn't have a professional recording of it. So there's clearly still a lot of work to do, but by people being brave, by kids of color being brave, by kids and students and musicians who have that privilege, they're speaking out on behalf of those kids of color and behalf of the musicians of color to help make orchestra a more welcoming place. You have so much responsibility in such a good way. You can make such a huge difference and really stand up so that when the next generation comes up, they're not even going to believe that these issues even existed in our field. Um, I have a lot of hope for the future. So keep on keeping on.
Yeah, I think adding for that, yeah, just I guess keep putting on the pressure. This is a problem that is not new. It is not something that is beyond our reach or our capacity to handle. It is just when are it's just a matter of when are the people in the positions of power to do something going to, and how to put pressure on them. And so I would say to the people who are not of color within classical music, take the time to educate yourself, and find, you know, these these composers and musicians of color, and learn about them, really learn about them, in the way that you would about Mozart, Beethoven, Schumann, um, and and really, in addition to educating yourself, being an advocate, because sometimes the sadly the voices of people of color get ignored. But if you being um, someone of a little bit with some privilege says something, that can go a long way to helping the cause as a whole. And so I think, as Terrence said, being brave, and you know, this is all about getting ourselves to a place where we can all freely enjoy this art without any of the classist or elitist traditions attached to it. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I just think it's incredibly important for white players to address their privilege and to be constantly working to lift up voices that we have been covering for hundreds of years.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you guys have any suggestions for pieces or composers or places where non-people of color can find music from people of color, from composers of color? Because I think for a lot of people, they really don't know where to start.
There is a website, composerdiversity.com, and it's for the Institute for Composer Diversity. And you can search composers by gender. You can search composers by nationality, by race, all of the above, and find a um, like a Native American composer, like a Native American composer of color who is a woman who wrote 2 string orchestra pieces 50 years ago. You could find that exists, and it has a link to their website. Um, I found that very, very helpful in trying to find music that maybe you didn't know existed, and it's actually there, and there's so many composers there. So yeah, the website is composerdiversity.com, and I found that very, very helpful. It's a good database.
Yeah. All right. Thank you all very much for your time. I hope whoever's watching, you found this useful, or hopefully it inspires you to take some initiative and try to promote awareness for this. And yeah, thank you guys very much, and I'll see you guys next time. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tim.
Thank you.